I was standing in the middle of Albuquerque International Airport, holding my mother's ashes in both arms, tears running down my face, and my sister Bet was nowhere. She had just walked away and left me there, alone, with Mom. But then TSA pulled Bet's carry-on off the belt, unzipped it right there in front of everyone. And what fell out of that bag told me exactly why she ran. If you've ever been the one who always got left behind in your own family, stay with me. This one's going to hit close to home. My name is Willa. I'm 43 years old. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And 3 weeks ago, I stood in an airport holding a ceramic urn that contained everything left of my mother, Opaline. She was 68 when she died, pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal, the way that disease always is. 8 weeks from diagnosis to gone. 8 weeks that felt like 8 years and 8 seconds at the same time. I keep trying to find the right words to describe what grief feels like when you lose a complicated mother. It's not clean. It's not the kind of grief you see in movies where someone cries beautifully and then slowly heals. It's messy and sharp and full of questions that will never get answered now. It's crying in a grocery store parking lot because you saw her brand of instant coffee. It's also, and I'm not proud of this, feeling a complicated, guilty relief that the woman who spent 43 years making you feel invisible is finally, permanently gone. That's the part nobody tells you about losing a mother who didn't love you equally. Opaline had 2 daughters, me, Willa, the older one, and my sister Bet, who is 4 years younger and who, from the moment she was born, became the entire center of our mother's universe. I don't say that dramatically. I say it as a documented fact of my childhood. Bet was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who made Mom laugh, the one whose school plays Mom attended with a video camera and actual tears of pride. I was the one who sat in the back of the auditorium watching, wondering what it would feel like to have someone look at me the way Mom looked at her. I remember being 12 years old, standing in our kitchen in the pale yellow light of a Tuesday morning, and asking my mother if she loved me and Bet the same. Just asking, the way kids do when they already know the answer but need to hear it said out loud anyway. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove and said, "Don't ask stupid questions before school, Willa." I never asked again. That was the thing about Opaline. She never said cruel things loudly. She was too refined for that. Her cruelty was quiet, surgical, delivered with a turned back or a changed subject or a smile that was just slightly warmer for Bet than it ever was for me. You couldn't point at a single moment and say, "There, that's when she broke me." It was 1,000 small moments, 1,000 tiny withdrawals of warmth, 1,000 ways of communicating without ever using words, that I was the daughter she merely tolerated while Bet was the one she actually loved. Bet knew it too. She never said it directly either. But she wore Mom's favoritism the way some women wear expensive perfume, casually, constantly, like she'd simply been born into it and couldn't help that you had to smell it everywhere she went. Growing up, I told myself it didn't matter. I built a life. I got married young, divorced young, raised my son Grayson mostly on my own, built a small bookkeeping business from nothing, made real friends, found real peace. I genuinely believed I had made peace with who my mother was and who she wasn't to me. And then the phone call came. It was a Wednesday in early October when Bet called to tell me Mom had been diagnosed. I remember I was sitting at my kitchen table paying bills when my phone lit up with Bet's name. I almost didn't answer. We weren't close, hadn't been for years. Our relationship existed in the narrow space of holiday texts and the occasional birthday call that never lasted more than 4 minutes. "Mom's sick," Bet said. No greeting, no softening. Just those 2 words dropped into the phone like stones into still water. "How sick?" I asked. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to tell me everything. "Bad sick, Willa," she said quietly. "Come home." And just like that, 43 years of distance collapsed into nothing. Because no matter what Opaline had or hadn't been to me, she was still my mother. She was still the woman whose hands I had memorized as a child, whose voice I still sometimes heard in my own when I was tired, whose face I still saw in my mirror every single morning, whether I wanted to or not. I booked a flight that same night. I landed in Albuquerque. Mom had moved back here 7 years ago, after Dad Cresswell retired, on a Thursday morning with 1 suitcase and absolutely no idea what I was walking into. Bet had already been there for 3 days. Of course she had. Bet always arrived first to anything that mattered, planted her flag, and made sure everyone knew she was the one holding things together. When I walked through Mom's front door, the first thing I noticed was that it smelled different, clean in a deliberate way, like someone had scrubbed and arranged and organized everything specifically to be noticed. Fresh flowers on the kitchen table, Bet's cardigan draped over the back of Mom's favorite chair like she'd already moved in, a casserole dish on the counter with a little handwritten note tucked underneath it that said, "Made with love, B." Bet was sitting on the couch next to Mom when I came in, holding her hand, murmuring something soft and low. Mom looked small. That was the first shock. Opaline had always been a tall, straight-backed woman who walked into rooms like she owned them. But sitting there against those couch cushions, wrapped in a blanket even though it was 62 degrees outside, she looked like she had already started the process of becoming smaller. Becoming less. She looked up when I walked in, and the expression on her face. I searched it the way I had searched it my whole life, looking for warmth, looking for that particular softening that I watched happen so easily when she looked at Bet. There was something there. Affection, maybe. Relief, possibly. But it was complicated in the way everything with Opaline was always complicated. Layered over with something reserved, something held back, something that said I'm glad you're here without ever quite saying I missed you. Willa, she said. Just my name, nothing else. Hi, Mom, I said, and I crossed the room and hugged her carefully, feeling her shoulder blades through the blanket like two small wings, and I pressed my face into her hair and breathed her in and told myself not to cry yet. Not yet. Bet watched this over Mom's shoulder with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite warm, not quite hostile. Something in between. The look of a woman calculating something while keeping her face perfectly neutral. That should have been my first signal. The next few weeks settled into a strange, exhausting rhythm. I took the guest room. Bet had already claimed the larger spare bedroom without discussion. Another flag planted. We split the caregiving in theory, but not in practice. I handled the medical appointments, the pharmacy runs, the insurance calls, the brutal paperwork that comes with a terminal diagnosis. Bet made the casseroles and sat beside Mom and held her hand and made her laugh and was present in all the visible, photographable ways that I was not. I noticed, of course. I noticed every time Mom's face lit up when Bet walked into the room in a way it simply didn't when I did. I noticed every time Bet arranged herself in the chair closest to Mom during doctor visits and spoke on her behalf in that soft, authoritative voice Mom would prefer and Mom doesn't like, as if she were the only one who had access to who our mother was. I noticed every time I brought Mom her medication and she took it and said thank you, in the same polite tone she might use with a nurse, and then turned to Bet 2 minutes later and squeezed her hand and said, "I'm so glad you're here, sweetheart." 43 years, and it still landed like a fresh wound every single time. One night, maybe 2 weeks in, I was washing dishes after dinner, and Mom was resting, and Bet came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter and watched me for a moment before she spoke. "She's not going to make it to Christmas," Bet said, flat, practical, like she was discussing a flight connection. I kept washing. "I know. We should start thinking about arrangements." "I know, Bet." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "She wants her ashes scattered in Bayford, back where she grew up," she told me last week. I turned off the faucet and turned around. "She told you?" "Yes. She didn't mention it to me." Bet gave me that small, careful smile. "She probably didn't want to upset you." And there it was, right there in that kitchen, in those exact words, the entire architecture of my childhood rebuilt in one sentence. Mom tells Bet the important things. Mom protects Bet from difficulty. Mom assumes Willa can handle being left out because Willa has always handled being left out. I dried my hands on the dish towel and looked at my sister. "Fine," I said. "Then we'll take her to Beaufort together." Bet nodded. "Together," she agreed. She was already lying. Mom died on a Sunday morning, just before dawn. I know because I was the one sitting beside her when it happened. Bet had gone to bed around midnight. "I need a few hours, Willa. I'm completely drained." And I had taken the chair beside Mom's bed without argument, without resentment, just settled in with a cup of cold coffee and the particular silence of a house that knows something is coming. I was holding Mom's hand when her breathing changed, that horrible, rattling shift that hospice had warned us about. I leaned forward and put my other hand on her cheek, and I talked to her, quietly. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I understood she did the best she could with what she had. I told her that whatever she hadn't been able to give me, I had found other ways to fill. I told her I loved her. Because I did. God help me, in spite of everything, in spite of 43 years of feeling like the wrong daughter. I did. She took one long, slow breath. And then she didn't take another one. I sat there in the gray pre-dawn light for a long time before I went and knocked on Bet's door. Long enough to have one last private moment with Opaline that belonged only to me. Long enough to say the things I needed to say without Bet in the room measuring my grief against hers and finding it somehow insufficient. When I knocked and Bet opened the door, her hair was already neat. Her eyes were dry. She looked at my face, and she knew immediately, and she made a sound, a sharp, theatrical gasp, and pushed past me toward Mom's room. And I stood in that hallway watching her go, feeling something strange and hollow and unnameable moving through my chest. The days after were a blur of phone calls and paperwork and the specific cruelty of funeral administration. There were decisions to make, the kind that reveal everything about family dynamics when you're too exhausted to pretend anymore. Bet inserted herself into every single one. The funeral home calls, the obituary wording, the flower arrangements. She consulted me on exactly none of it, then presented each decision as already made, as if my opinion were a courtesy she couldn't quite afford to extend. The one thing she did discuss, the one thing, was the ashes. 4 days after Mom died, we were sitting at the kitchen table going through paperwork when Bet slid a piece of paper across to me. It was a printed flight itinerary. 2 seats, Albuquerque to Savannah, connecting through Atlanta. Departure in 6 days. I booked us, she said. Savannah is the closest airport to Beaufort. We drive down from there, scatter her ashes at the water like she wanted, fly back. I looked at the itinerary. Both our names, side by side. Something loosened slightly in my chest. Not trust? I had learned too many years ago not to trust Bet easily. But something adjacent to hope. The idea that maybe, just this once, we could do one thing together correctly. For Mom, for whatever version of a family we had always almost been. Okay, I said. That works. The funeral home said the ashes will be ready in 3 days, Bet continued, not looking up from her own papers. I'll handle the pickup. I can go with you. I'll handle it, Willa. Her voice was gentle but final, the way it always was when she was closing a door. You handle the house paperwork, split the work. I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I was exhausted and grieving and still carrying the specific numbness that comes after you watch someone take their last breath, and I did not have the emotional bandwidth to fight over who drove to the funeral home. So Bet picked up the ashes alone. She brought the urn home and set it on the mantel, and we both stood there looking at it for a moment without speaking. It was a plain ceramic urn, gray and smooth and devastatingly ordinary for a woman who had been so many complicated, vivid, difficult things. She's really gone, Bet said softly. Yeah, I said. She is. For just that one moment, standing there in front of what was left of Opaline, I felt something real pass between me and my sister, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of a shared loss that belonged equally to both of us regardless of everything else. It didn't last. 2 days before the flight, Bet came to me with a carefully arranged expression, concerned, apologetic, slightly pained, and told me that she needed to pack the urn in her carry-on bag. Why yours? I asked immediately. Because my bag is the right size, she said smoothly. Yours is too small. The urn needs to be padded properly. I already looked it up. TSA has specific rules about cremated remains. They have to stay in the carry-on. Can't go in checked luggage. That part was actually true. I had looked it up myself the night before. Cremated remains had to be carried on. TSA could not open the urn itself, but they would scan it. It all made logical sense. And yet something sat wrong in my stomach. Something small and instinctive and quiet. We could get a smaller container, I said. Split the ashes between 2 bags. Bet looked at me with an expression of gentle, patient disappointment. The exact expression she had been perfecting since we were children. Willa, she's our mother. We're not splitting her up like leftover groceries. And just like that, she made my reasonable concern feel petty and cold. I handed over the urn. I stood there and watched Bet carefully, tenderly wrap our mother in bubble wrap and nestle her into the interior of her large gray carry-on bag, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief was making me suspicious of everything. I told myself that Bet, whatever her flaws, Whatever the complicated architecture of her relationship with mom, would not, could not, do something truly terrible with our mother's remains. 6 days after we buried Opaline, I woke up at 4 in the morning, got dressed in the dark, drank half a cup of coffee standing at the kitchen sink, and drove to Albuquerque International Airport believing I was about to do the last loving thing I could do for my mother. I had absolutely no idea what was actually about to happen. The airport was quiet the way airports only are at 5 in the morning. That particular hollow stillness of fluorescent lights and rolling suitcases and people moving through space with their eyes not quite open yet. Bet had insisted on driving us both. Another decision made without discussion. Another small flag planted. She was quiet in the car, not the comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill silence, but the tight, concentrated quiet of someone running calculations behind their eyes. I noticed. I filed it away. I told myself I was projecting. We checked in at the counter together. Bet had her large gray carry-on, the one with mom inside, slung over her shoulder, handling it with a casualness that made something twitch uncomfortably in my chest. I had my smaller bag and my purse, and the specific hollowness of a woman about to fly her mother's remains across the country to scatter them in water. At the security line, something shifted. We joined the queue together, side by side, the way we had done everything these past weeks. Technically together, fundamentally separate. The line moved slowly. Bet was on her phone, scrolling with one thumb, her carry-on at her feet. I watched the TSA officers at the front, watched bags disappear into the scanner, watched the ordinary choreography of airport security that you stop noticing after you've traveled enough. Then Bet's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and something happened to her face. Just for a fraction of a second, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of her jaw, before her expression smoothed back to neutral. She stepped half a step away from me and answered in a low voice. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want to be clear about that. I was simply standing there, 3 feet away, in a quiet airport at 5 in the morning. Not now, I heard her say. Then, even lower. I have it. It's handled. I'll call you when I land. She hung up and turned back and caught me looking at her. Work, she said immediately. Smooth. Easy. Bet hadn't worked a regular 9 to 5 in 11 years. She did freelance interior consulting, her words, which mostly meant she took on occasional projects when she felt like it, and lived off a combination of that income and, as I had long suspected, our mother's quiet financial generosity. A work call at 5 in the morning, 2 days after our mother's funeral, on a flight day, had absolutely no logical explanation. I said nothing. We moved forward in the line. Bet hoisted her carry-on onto the belt. I placed my bag beside it. We stepped through the body scanner one at a time, me first, then Bet. I collected my bag on the other side and turned around. And that's when everything stopped. The TSA officer, a broad-shouldered woman with close-cropped gray hair and the particular expression of someone who has seen everything twice, had her hand on Bet's carry-on. She was not moving it forward. She was looking at her screen with the focused stillness of someone who has found something unexpected. Ma'am, she said to Bet, is this your bag? Yes, Bet said. Still smooth, still easy. There's a cremation urn inside. My mother. I have the documentation. I understand that, ma'am. I need you to step over here, please. A second officer appeared. The bag was lifted off the belt and carried to the side table. Bet followed, and I followed Bet, my heart doing something strange and fast inside my chest. This was not unusual. TSA routinely did secondary checks on bags containing urns. I knew that. I had read it. I told myself this was routine. But Bet's face was not the face of a woman experiencing a routine TSA check. It was the face of a woman trying very hard to appear calm while something underneath was fracturing. Her jaw was set, her eyes were moving, just slightly, just enough, between the bag and the officer and the exit doors in the way that eyes move when a mind is running options. The officer unzipped the carry-on. She moved aside the bubble wrap around the urn carefully, professionally. She scanned the urn, set it aside, and then she continued going through the bag. There's nothing else in there, Bet said. Her voice had changed. Just slightly. A new tightness in it, a new careful quality. Just the urn and my clothes. The officer didn't respond. She was lifting out a folded gray sweater, then a toiletry bag, then a rolled pair of jeans. And then she reached into the interior zip pocket, the flat one along the back panel that you'd never notice unless you were looking. And she pulled out a large manila envelope, thick, sealed, with a name written on the front in black marker. Not Bet's name, not my name. A man's name I had never seen before, R. Kavanaugh, with a Beaufort, South Carolina address written beneath it. The officer looked at Bet. Bet looked at the envelope. And the color, every drop of it, drained completely out of my sister's face. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's in this envelope?" Bet opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched my sister, composed, calculating, golden child Bet, have absolutely nothing to say. I looked at that envelope. I looked at that name. And something cold and clarifying moved through me from my feet to the top of my skull, because I suddenly understood with complete, terrible certainty that this trip to Beaufort had never been about scattering our mother's ashes. It had never been about Mom at all. The TSA officer asked Bet a second time. Calm, professional, immovable. "Ma'am, what is in this envelope?" Bet's composure cracked the way expensive china cracks, not shattering all at once, but splitting along a fault line you never knew was there, suddenly visible, suddenly irreversible. She straightened her shoulders. She did that thing she always did when cornered. Lifted her chin slightly, recalibrated, reached for a version of dignity that the situation no longer afforded her. "It's personal documents," she said. "Legal papers. Whose legal papers?" A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "A family associate." The officer set the envelope flat on the table. She did not open it. TSA isn't authorized to open sealed documents without cause, but she held it with the particular deliberate stillness of someone communicating that it was not going anywhere. A third officer had materialized quietly at the edge of my vision. The atmosphere around that table had changed, thickened, sharpened, in the way atmospheres do when something has shifted from routine to something else entirely. I stepped forward. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Bet, what is in that envelope?" She turned to look at me, and for just one fractured moment I saw it. The real thing underneath all the composure and calculation and careful performance she had been running her entire life. Something that was almost panic. Something that was almost shame. It lasted less than 2 seconds before she buried it again, beneath a look of cool, exhausted patience. "Willa, this isn't the place. What is in the envelope?" "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it." My voice dropped lower. "Right now, in front of these people. Because I swear to you, Bet, if you don't tell me what's going on, I will stand here until someone opens it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the envelope. Then she exhaled. A long, slow breath through her nose, and something in her posture changed. Not surrender exactly. More like a woman deciding which version of the truth she could afford to release. "It's Mom's property documents," she said quietly. "The Beaufort house." The world tilted slightly. "What Beaufort house?" Bet pressed her lips together. "Mom owned a property in Beaufort. A small house. She bought it 12 years ago. It was her plan to retire there eventually. She never told you because—" She paused, chose her words. "Because she knew you'd make it difficult." I stood there absorbing this information while my brain simultaneously tried to process it and reject it. Mom had owned property for 12 years, property in the exact city we were flying to, property I had never been told about, and my sister was hand-delivering documents about that property to a man named R. Kavanaugh with a Beaufort address. 2 days after our mother's funeral, before the estate had been legally processed, before any will had been formally read. "Who is R. Kavanaugh?" I asked. Bet's eyes shifted. "Mom's property manager." "Why are you hand-delivering documents to her property manager 2 days after she died?" "Because there are time-sensitive things that need to be handled." "Bet." My voice came out sharp enough that the TSA officer glanced at me. I lowered it deliberately. "Stop talking to me like I am stupid." She closed her mouth. I turned to the officer. "Is there somewhere private we can go?" What followed in the next 40 minutes I can only describe as the systematic dismantling of a lie that had been constructed so carefully, over so many years, that I hadn't even known I was living inside it. In a small airport security office with gray walls and a folding table, with a TSA supervisor present, because Bet had made the specific mistake of initially misrepresenting the contents of her bag, describing it as personal items when legal documents technically required declaration, Bet's story came apart piece by piece. The Beaufort house was real. Mom had bought it in the year I got divorced. the year I was so consumed with rebuilding my own life that I hadn't been paying close attention to hers. It was a 3-bedroom property 2 blocks from the waterfront. In 12 years, it had appreciated to a value of just over $400,000. And 6 weeks ago, while Mom was still alive, while she was still breathing and speaking and theoretically capable of making her own decisions, while Bet had been the one handling all of Mom's affairs because I lived in another city and trusted that my sister was doing it honestly, Mom had signed a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership of that property directly to Bet. No lawyer present, no independent witness, no notification to me. Just Bet and Mom and a document that made $400,000 of property disappear from the estate before Mom was even gone. The documents in that envelope were the final step. R. Kavanaugh wasn't a property manager. He was a private real estate attorney in Beaufort who Bet had hired to finalize the transfer, record the deed, and make the whole transaction legally airtight before any formal estate proceedings could question it. She had been planning this trip the entire time. The ashes were real. I want to be clear about that, because even now some part of me needed to confirm it. Mom was in that urn. Bet hadn't fabricated the scattering, but the scattering had been a cover, a built-in reason for the trip that no one, not me, not any future estate attorney, not any judge, could question without looking like a monster. Who would accuse someone of wrongdoing on the day they scatter their mother's ashes? I sat in that gray room and I listened and I felt something move through me that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't just anger. Anger was too simple. It wasn't just grief, though grief was absolutely there, fresh and vicious, the grief of losing your mother all over again in a completely different way. It was something older and colder and more specific than either of those things. It was the feeling of 43 years of small suspicions being confirmed simultaneously. Every turned back, every closed door, every she probably didn't want to upset you. Every single moment I had talked myself out of trusting my own instincts about my sister crystallized into one cold clarifying point. I had never been paranoid. I had always been right. I looked at Bet across that folding table. She was sitting with her hands flat on the surface, her composure mostly reassembled, doing the thing she always did, waiting for me to fall apart so she could position herself as the reasonable one, waiting for me to cry or yell or accuse so she could arrange her face into patient disappointment and make my legitimate fury look like instability. I didn't give her that. I sat very still. I kept my voice very quiet. And I said the thing I had been preparing my whole life to say without ever knowing it. I need you to understand something, Bet. Not as your sister, just as a person sitting across from you. I know everything now, and I am going to deal with every single piece of it. Legally, completely, and there is nothing you can say in the next 30 seconds that will change what happens next. She opened her mouth. Not finished, I said. You used Mom's ashes as a prop. You wrapped our mother in bubble wrap and put her in a bag next to a fraudulent property transfer, and you were going to scatter her on the same trip you used to steal from her estate. And you were going to let me stand there and cry at the water and believe we were doing something sacred together. The TSA supervisor shifted uncomfortably in the corner. Bet's jaw tightened. And then, quietly, with a coldness I felt physically, she said, Mom wanted me to have it, Willa. She chose me. She always chose me. That's not theft. That's just the truth you've never been able to accept. I looked at my sister for a long moment. Yeah, I said finally, she did choose you. And look what you did with it. I stood up, picked up Mom's urn from the table where the officer had set it, held it against my chest, and walked out of that room. I walked back out into the main terminal with Mom in my arms, and I just stood there for a moment in the middle of all that ordinary airport movement. People rushing to gates, rolling suitcases, a child crying somewhere near the coffee kiosk, an announcement echoing off the high ceiling about a delayed flight to Denver, and I breathed. Just breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep yourself from dissolving completely in a public place. I didn't book a new flight right away. I found a row of seats near the window, the kind that look out onto the tarmac where the planes sit enormous and patient in the early morning light, and I sat down and I held Mom, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not just the betrayal, though that was enormous and present and real, but the grief underneath it, the specific grief of understanding that your mother's favoritism hadn't ended with her death, that Bet had simply continued it, extended it, formalized it into a legal document while Mom was still breathing. Mom had let her. That was the part I kept circling back to, the part with the sharpest edge. Opaline had known. She had sat in that house while Bet arranged the quitclaim deed, and she had signed her name to it. Maybe she told herself it was practical. Maybe she told herself it was what she wanted. Maybe in those final foggy, medicated weeks, she hadn't fully understood what she was signing. I would never know. The woman who could have answered that question had taken the last breath in that gray pre-dawn bedroom and left me to untangle the aftermath alone. I sat at that window for almost 2 hours. Then I called Nadine. Nadine had been my closest friend for 19 years. We had met at a community center pottery class of all places, two women who had both shown up alone on a Tuesday evening and bonded immediately over our mutual terrible pottery and our mutual excellent wine. She was a paralegal, had been for 22 years, and she answered on the second ring even though it was barely 7 in the morning, and listened without interrupting while I told her everything in one long, unbroken, slightly breathless torrent. When I finished, there was a short silence. "Willa," she said, "tell me Bet hasn't filed that deed yet." "The attorney in Beaufort has the documents. She was hand-delivering them today." Okay, listen to me carefully. A quitclaim deed has to be recorded with the County Register of Deeds to be legally effective. If it hasn't been recorded yet, there may be grounds to challenge it, especially if your mother was on any kind of medication that could be argued to have affected her capacity, especially if there was no independent attorney present at signing. My hand tightened on the phone. What do I need to do? First, do not let Bet leave that airport with those documents. I was already standing. I won't pretend what followed was simple or clean or quick. Real justice, the legal kind, the lasting kind, never is. But I will tell you what happened, step by step, because every step mattered. I went back to the security office. The TSA supervisor was still there completing his incident report. Bet had misrepresented her bag contents and there was paperwork to process. I asked if I could speak with him privately for 3 minutes. He said yes. I told him that the documents in that envelope were potentially part of an ongoing estate fraud and that I needed to contact an attorney before those documents left the building. I asked if there was any mechanism, any at all, that could delay their return to my sister until I could make that call. He looked at me carefully. Then he said that since Bet had provided inconsistent information about her bag, standard procedure required her to remain for a complete secondary review, which could take up to 90 minutes. 90 minutes was enough. Nadine called an estate attorney she knew, a woman named Judith, sharp and fast, and exactly the kind of person you want on your side when everything is on fire, and Judith made 2 calls within the hour. One to the Beaufort County Register of Deeds office to flag the property address and request notification of any filing attempts, one to a South Carolina colleague who could file for a temporary injunction blocking the deed transfer pending an estate challenge. The deed had not yet been recorded. R. Kavanaugh had been waiting for the physical documents Bet was hand-delivering. Without them, he couldn't file. And with Judith's flag on the property, any attempt to file would trigger an immediate legal challenge. Bet walked out of that secondary review to find me standing in the terminal with my phone in my hand and an expression she had never seen on my face before. Not anger, not hurt, not the particular defeated resignation she had been watching me wear our whole lives. Something new. Something settled and cold and completely immovable. I held up my phone. Judith Harmon, estate attorney, has already contacted Beaufort County. The property is flagged. The deed cannot be recorded pending estate challenge. You should call your own attorney. Bet stared at me. You had 43 years, I said quietly. 43 years of Mom choosing you, favoring you, giving you everything she withheld from me. I never fought you for any of it. I made my peace and I built my life and I let you have all of it because fighting you felt like it cost more than it was worth. I paused. This is different. You forged a path around a legal estate process to steal a $400,000 property 2 days after our mother died. That is not favoritism. That is fraud, and I will not make peace with it. She tried one more time. That was very Bet. She always tried one more time. Mom is in my arms, I said, and she can't speak for herself anymore. That's exactly why the law exists. I walked away. The legal process took 7 months. I won't compress it into something cleaner than it was. There were depositions and document requests, and one absolutely brutal afternoon where I sat across a conference table from Bet and a team of her attorneys and answered questions about my mother's mental state in her final weeks. There were moments I doubted myself. There were nights I sat in my kitchen in Albuquerque at 2 in the morning, wondering if I was doing the right thing, if Mom would have wanted this, if fighting for an inheritance made me as calculating as the sister I was fighting against. And then I would remember Bet's voice in that airport security office. She always chose me. That's just the truth you've never been able to accept. And I would remember that I wasn't fighting for the money. I was fighting because someone had to say, clearly, legally, on the record, that what Bet did was wrong. That you cannot dress up theft in grief and expect it to go unexamined. That the invisible daughter deserved to be seen, even if the only person doing the seeing was a judge in a South Carolina courtroom. The judge ruled that the quitclaim deed had been executed under conditions that raised substantial concern about undue influence, given Opaline's documented medical state and the absence of independent legal counsel at signing. The deed was voided. The Beaufort property went into the estate and was split equally between Bet and me per the terms of Mom's actual will, a will that, notably, Bet had never mentioned existed. $200,000, my half. I didn't throw a party. I didn't call anyone to celebrate. I sat in my car in the parking garage after the ruling, and I cried for a long time. Not happy tears exactly, not victorious tears, something more complicated. The tears of a woman who won something she never should have had to fight for in the first place. 6 weeks after the ruling, I flew to Beaufort alone. It was a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of southern morning where the air smells like salt water and something flowering and the light comes in low and golden across the marsh grass. I drove from the airport along the coast road with Mom's urn on the passenger seat beside me, buckled in because I am my mother's daughter in more ways than I ever wanted to admit. And Opaline never went anywhere without her seatbelt. I found the spot by instinct more than memory, a small dock at the edge of a tidal creek that I had seen in an old photograph Mom kept on her dresser for as long as I could remember. A photograph she had never explained and I had never asked about, a place that had clearly meant something to her long before either Bet or I existed. I stood at the end of that dock for a long time before I opened the urn. I thought about Opaline, not the complicated version, not the mother who turned toward Bet and away from me, not the woman who signed documents she shouldn't have signed, not the absence and the coolness and the thousand small withdrawals. I thought about her hands, the way she hummed while she cooked. The one time, I was 7 years old, that she sat beside me on the back porch steps during a thunderstorm because I was afraid of the lightning, and she put her arm around me and didn't say anything, just sat there warm and solid and present until the storm passed. She never did it again. But she did it once. I held on to that. I opened the urn and I let the wind carry her out over the water, gray and fine and catching the morning light in a way that was almost beautiful, and I said goodbye. Properly. Without performance, without audience, without Bet standing beside me calculating how her grief looked from the outside. Just me and Mom and the marsh and the light. And for the first time in 43 years, I felt like enough. I drove back to the airport that afternoon, and I sat at my gate, and I looked out at the tarmac, and I thought about what it means to spend a lifetime being the one who gets left behind. The one who handles the paperwork while someone else holds the hand. The one who sits in the dark in the final hours while someone else sleeps. The one who is told, in 1,000 quiet ways, that she is loved less, valued less, worth less, and then I thought about what it means to keep going anyway. To build your life in the negative space of someone else's love. To find out, at 43 years old, in a TSA security office in Albuquerque, that you were right all along. Not just about the fraud, but about everything. That your instincts were never broken. That your pain was never paranoia. That you were never the problem. That is worth something. I don't have a cleaner way to say it than that.